There is a moment, quiet, subtle, but unmistakable, when you realize you have been manipulated. It might come in the form of a small betrayal, a friend who twisted your words, a boss who praised you just enough to earn your silence, a lover who masked control behind affection. And in that moment, as the pieces click into place, a strange mix of clarity and shame settles in. You wonder, how did I not see it? How did I let this happen? Manipulation is not always the grand theater of deception we imagine it to be. It is often quieter, dressed in charm, cloaked in logic, or softened by the language of care. And yet it operates with one goal: to bend your will to serve another's interests, sometimes without you even realizing it. This is not a modern plague. It is as old as power itself. Centuries ago, in Renaissance Italy, a man named Niccolò Machiavelli sat down to write a guidebook, not for the meek, but for rulers, not for the kind, but for the cunning. The Prince was his most infamous work. In it, he stripped power of its illusions and showed the world what leadership looks like when it is unfiltered by morality. To Machiavelli, manipulation was not sin. It was strategy. It was necessary. And above all, it worked. But Machiavelli did not invent manipulation. He simply named what already existed. In temples and courts, in marriages and markets, in wars and whispers. So why are we still caught off guard by it? Why do intelligent, emotionally aware people fall into these traps again and again? Because manipulation is not just about others being clever. It is about us, our unexamined needs, our hidden fears, the parts of us that still ache for validation, safety, or control. To never be manipulated again is not simply to build better defenses. It is to know ourselves so deeply that there is nothing left for a manipulator to grip. This journey begins not with Machiavelli, but with you, your boundaries, your history, your capacity to see clearly, even when someone offers love, opportunity, or certainty as bait. So today, we go deep, into psychology, into history, into ourselves. We will uncover how manipulation works, why it's so effective, how it hides in plain sight, and how, armed with awareness, you can stand in any room and remain fully in your power. Not harder, not colder, but clearer and free. To understand manipulation, especially through the lens of Machiavelli, we must begin with a clearer definition. Manipulation is the intentional shaping of another person's thoughts, feelings, or behavior, often without their full awareness, to serve a particular goal. Unlike influence, which can be mutual or transparent, manipulation is asymmetrical. It thrives on secrecy, ambiguity, and leverage. It is not always malicious, but it is always strategic. And throughout history, manipulation has been one of humanity's most consistent tools of power. In ancient Mesopotamia, political advisors whispered into the ears of kings, not just with counsel but with carefully framed truths. In Egyptian courts, royal scribes knew how to balance flattery with fear to remain in favor. The Greeks debated rhetoric and persuasion in their agoras, with sophists mastering the art of argument not to discover truth, but to win. And in imperial China, Confucian ideals of harmony were often used by courtiers to justify silencing dissent. But it was during the Italian Renaissance, a time of fragile states, secret alliances, and constant betrayals, that the machinery of manipulation was laid bare in intellectual form. Enter Niccolò Machiavelli. Born in 1469 in Florence, Machiavelli was not just a political theorist. He was a civil servant, diplomat, and someone who witnessed firsthand the cutthroat games of power between the Vatican, French monarchy, the Medicis, and rival city-states. When he wrote The Prince, it was not a fantasy. It was a manual forged in real-world observation. It shocked readers because it told the truth, that leaders must often choose between being good and being effective, and that those who wish to maintain power cannot afford to confuse the two. Machiavelli famously argued that it is better to be feared than loved, if one cannot be both. He warned that promises made by leaders are tools, not sacred commitments, that appearances matter more than intentions, that people are more easily controlled by fear of loss than hope for gain. He did not celebrate cruelty, but he accepted its usefulness. What frightened the church and later moral philosophers about Machiavelli was not his pessimism. It was his honesty. He dared to say what others only practiced in secret. But even centuries before Machiavelli, manipulation was a recognized theme in religion, myth, and literature. In the Mahabharata, Krishna persuades Arjuna to fight using a blend of divine truth and rhetorical mastery, knowing full well the emotional burden he is placing on him. In Genesis, the serpent in Eden uses subtlety rather than force, planting a question that unravels innocence. In Norse mythology, Loki manipulates both gods and mortals, often under the guise of wit and necessity. These stories did not present manipulation as simple evil. They showed its complexity. Manipulators are often charismatic, intelligent, even helpful at first. They exploit human blind spots, particularly our longing for clarity in uncertain times, for approval when we feel unseen, and for safety when we feel vulnerable. As societies evolved, so did the sophistication of manipulation. In medieval Europe, royal marriages were not unions of love, but chess moves. In colonial eras, imperial powers manipulated native populations with promises of trade, security, or shared governance, only to betray them later. Fast forward to the 20th century, and manipulation took on mass form. Propaganda became an industrial force. In Nazi Germany, Joseph Goebbels built entire campaigns around emotional resonance and repetition. In the United States, marketing psychology emerged, using Freudian insights to sell products by appealing to hidden desires, status, sex, belonging. Manipulation was no longer just interpersonal. It was institutional. Today, it has evolved yet again. In a digital age, manipulation hides inside algorithms, targeted ads, and curated identities. It speaks the language of empowerment while subtly directing behavior. It thrives on partial truths, viral outrage, and the illusion of choice. But what has remained constant? The human psyche. Despite all the changes in society, technology, and culture, people remain susceptible to manipulation for the same core reasons they always have: fear of rejection, need for belonging, desire for control, avoidance of pain. Manipulators, from Machiavelli's princes to modern-day influencers, understand that to control a person, one must first understand their psychology better than they understand it themselves. This is why Machiavelli's insights are still painfully relevant. While some may read The Prince as a cynical endorsement of ruthlessness, a more nuanced reading reveals something else: a mirror. He did not invent manipulation. He simply showed us how often we are blind to it. Today, when a manager uses charm to extract unpaid labor, when a partner guilt-trips us into compliance, or when a politician manufactures crisis to justify control, we are still living in Machiavelli's world. Or perhaps we are simply living in the same human condition he tried to illuminate. This is not to say we must become Machiavellian, but we must understand the Machiavellian if we wish to protect ourselves. Because manipulation often enters through the front door. It wears kindness like a costume. It appeals to our values while redirecting them. It cloaks itself in familiarity, intimacy, and even purpose. And it leaves us wondering, too late, why we feel hollow despite doing what felt right. So how do we respond? First, by acknowledging that manipulation is not only something others do to us, it is something we may also do, consciously or not, when we feel powerless, afraid, or unseen. Children learn to manipulate before they learn to spell. Adults just do it with more polish. To become immune to manipulation is not to become cold or paranoid. It is to become conscious. It is to understand the games so well that we no longer play them unconsciously. It is to look beyond the surface, to ask better questions, to spot the patterns. Machiavelli once wrote that people are quick to change their ruler in hopes of gaining something, only to realize later that the new ruler is no better than the old. The wisdom in that line is not just political. It is psychological. We often trade one manipulative dynamic for another because we are focused on the surface, not the structure. We look for comfort, not clarity. But if we want to never be manipulated again, we must do what few are willing to do. Slow down, observe more deeply, and begin the long work of knowing ourselves. Because manipulation, at its core, only succeeds when there is something within us that wants to believe the lie. Next, we will explore exactly what those inner forces are, the psychological patterns that make us vulnerable, and how understanding them is the first step toward reclaiming our power. To truly protect ourselves from manipulation, it is not enough to study history or read strategies. We must descend into the deeper layers, the psychological terrain where manipulation takes root. Because manipulation does not succeed in a vacuum. It succeeds in the fertile soil of unmet needs, unconscious fears, and identity wounds. And to see it clearly, we must understand how our own minds work, how we are wired for connection, how we crave certainty, and how easily our emotions can override logic. Let us start with a fundamental idea in modern psychology: attachment theory. Developed by John Bowlby and expanded by Mary Ainsworth, attachment theory shows how our earliest relationships, especially with caregivers, shape the way we respond to emotional closeness and perceived threats. Those with secure attachment tend to trust their instincts and maintain healthy boundaries. But those with anxious or avoidant attachment styles may either cling to others or withdraw from them, often in confusing, painful cycles. Manipulators, consciously or not, exploit these patterns. For example, if someone has an anxious attachment style, they may tolerate emotional breadcrumbs in relationships, fearing that asserting their needs will cause abandonment. A manipulator senses this. They may alternate warmth with distance, creating a push-pull dynamic that keeps the anxious person in a loop, constantly trying to win back affection. This is not just romantic. It happens in families, friendships, even workplaces. Another key concept is gaslighting. Coined from a 1944 film, Gaslight, this psychological manipulation tactic involves making someone doubt their own memory, perception, or sanity. It is insidious because it targets the foundation of self-trust. A gaslighter may say, "I never said that," "You're overreacting," or "You always take things the wrong way," phrases that, over time, destabilize your sense of reality. Gaslighting thrives in environments where emotional expression is discouraged, and where the manipulator holds some form of social or emotional power. It is not just a distortion of facts, it is a war on perception. And when you no longer trust what you see, you look to the manipulator for guidance. That is how control begins. This leads us to another essential idea: cognitive dissonance. Coined by psychologist Leon Festinger, cognitive dissonance describes the psychological discomfort we feel when our beliefs and behaviors contradict each other. For example, if we see ourselves as kind and reasonable but stay in a situation where we are being mistreated, we experience dissonance. Instead of leaving, we may adjust our beliefs, telling ourselves the other person is not so bad, or that we are overreacting. In this way, manipulation continues, not because we do not see it, but because admitting it would rupture our self-image. Festinger's theory helps explain why people stay in toxic environments, relationships, or ideologies long after they realize something is wrong. It is not just fear, it is the mind's desperate attempt to make chaos feel coherent. Another psychological pattern often weaponized by manipulators is reciprocity. Humans are wired to return favors. If someone does something kind, helpful, or generous, we feel a sense of obligation. But manipulators often use this instinct strategically. They may love bomb you early in a relationship, offer help you never asked for, or give you gifts. only to cash in later with demands, guilt, or leverage. Social psychologist Robert Cialdini identified reciprocity as one of 6 key principles of influence. His work shows that even small gestures can create a strong pull to comply, even when it goes against our better judgment. Recognizing this allows us to ask, am I agreeing because I want to, or because I feel I owe them something? This is where modern science meets ancient insight. In Sufi wisdom, for example, there is a teaching that says, "Be like the earth, receive all things, but let none possess you." The idea is to cultivate presence, so that kindness does not blind you and criticism does not shake you. When you are centered in your own self-worth, manipulation loses its grip. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychoanalyst, offers another lens. He spoke of the shadow, the hidden, repressed parts of ourselves we are unwilling to acknowledge. Manipulators often access our shadow not by attacking us, but by appealing to it. They flatter our pride, feed our vanity, or offer what our ego craves. When we do not own our shadow, it can be used against us. Jung also introduced the idea of archetypes, universal characters that live in the collective unconscious. The trickster, for example, is an archetype that shows up in every culture. From Loki in Norse mythology to the fox in African tales, the trickster manipulates through wit, illusion, and paradox. Jung believed the trickster was not evil, but a necessary figure, one who exposes the parts of us that are naive, rigid, or blind. In this sense, manipulators are not always villains. Sometimes they are mirrors. They show us where we have yet to mature, where we give our power away, where we long for shortcuts instead of truth. Modern neuroscience also supports this idea. The brain's amygdala, responsible for emotional processing, can override the prefrontal cortex, which governs logic and decision-making. In other words, when we are emotionally triggered, whether through fear, affection, or shame, we become less rational and more suggestible. Manipulators know this. They create emotional intensity to bypass your clarity. If you feel too much, you stop thinking clearly. That is by design. But awareness is the antidote. When you understand your own wiring, your needs, your triggers, your core beliefs, you become harder to manipulate. You begin to pause before reacting. You start asking better questions. Why did that compliment feel off? Why do I feel guilty when I say no? Am I making this choice from fear or clarity? You stop being a passive player in someone else's game and become an active author of your own narrative. This is why emotional intelligence matters more than raw intellect when it comes to resisting manipulation. You can be brilliant and still be blind if you do not know your own wounds. But when you are self-aware, emotionally regulated, and deeply honest with yourself, manipulators lose their usual entry points. The Stoics taught this centuries ago. Epictetus said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." Freedom, to them, was not just physical. It was internal. The Stoic trained themselves to respond, not react, to observe emotion, but not be ruled by it. This emotional sovereignty made them resilient to manipulation, not because they lacked emotion, but because they were not owned by it. In today's world, where every app, ad, and algorithm is designed to influence your choices, emotional sovereignty is revolutionary. And it begins with practices: self-reflection, journaling, meditation, therapy, anything that helps you slow down and witness your inner world. You are not weak for being manipulated. You are human, but you become wise when you learn why. Machiavelli understood the external dynamics of power. Modern psychology teaches us the internal ones. When you unite the two, when you understand both the manipulator in his game and your own inner architecture, you step into a rare kind of power. Not the power to control others, but the power to remain rooted in yourself. This is what it means to be truly free. Next, we will explore what happens when we do not learn this, when manipulation goes unrecognized. The impact it has not only on our choices, but on our identity, relationships, and inner peace. You may wonder, if I know the tactics, if I set boundaries, if I journal and reflect, why do I still find myself swayed? Why do I still hesitate to speak, still give more than I want to, still feel the echo of other people's voices in my mind louder than my own? Because manipulation, at its deepest level, does not start outside you. It starts within, in the parts of you that are unresolved, in the fragments of self still hoping for permission to exist. Every manipulative dynamic you fall into has a corresponding vulnerability inside you. That doesn't mean it's your fault, but it does mean it's your work. The most effective manipulators don't create your weakness. They locate it. And if you do not see it for yourself, if you do not name and hold it with compassion, they will shape it for you. This is why surface-level defenses will never be enough. You can memorize every red flag, rehearse every boundary script, master every psychological trick, and still fall prey. Not because you're weak, but because part of you wants to believe the illusion. Because the illusion offers something: comfort, certainty, affection. And often, those are things you were once taught you had to earn. Think about it. The people most vulnerable to manipulation are often the ones who learned early to be attuned to others. People who survived by anticipating needs, smoothing tension, and shrinking themselves to maintain peace. In psychology, we call this fawning. In history, it's called survival. And while fawning may have saved you once, it will not liberate you. To do that, you must go deeper. You must meet the inner child who first learned that love must be bargained for. You must meet the inner protector who keeps you silent, compliant, agreeable, even when your soul is screaming. You must see how self-neglect has been disguised as compassion. Only then can you begin the real work, reparenting your inner world. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." This is never more true than in manipulation, because manipulation doesn't always feel like harm. Often it feels like destiny. The narcissist who reminds you of a parent you never pleased. The leader who validates your gifts, then drains your energy. The friend who always needs saving and leaves you empty. These patterns feel familiar because they are. But familiarity is not the same as truth. To break free, you must stop asking, "Why are they doing this to me?" and start asking, "Why do I keep allowing this?" Not with blame, with curiosity. Because here's the truth most people avoid. Manipulation cannot thrive in a person who fully knows and honors themselves. This is the spiritual dimension Machiavelli rarely acknowledged, the part he left out of his cunning calculus of power. But it is no less real. Power that does not begin with self-awareness inevitably leads to destruction, either of others or the self. And that brings us to a hard, liberating truth. The more you know yourself, the less others can define you. That is your true immunity. Not suspicion, not control, not even dominance, but radical self-knowledge. So what does that look like in practice? It means doing the emotional labor of facing your wounds, naming your core beliefs, asking questions like, what am I still trying to prove to others? Where did I learn that love is conditional? Who taught me that conflict means rejection? And then staying with those questions, even when the answers hurt. It means being honest about where you manipulate yourself. Where do you silence your truth to be liked? Where do you perform strength to avoid vulnerability? Where do you pretend not to care when you do? This is where the work becomes sacred. Because to be truly manipulation-proof is to become whole. Not perfect, whole. To accept every part of yourself, not just the confident adult, but the scared child, the angry teenager, the grieving shadow. To bring all of you into the light. The Sufis call this process nafs al-amara, the purification of the self from egoic illusions. Not to become ascetic or detached, but to become fully awake. so awake that you cannot be seduced by false promises, so anchored that no one can sell you a distorted mirror again. This is not fast work, this is life work, but every time you reclaim a part of yourself, your voice, your boundary, your worth, you make it harder for the world to twist your reflection. And here's the quiet beauty of this path. You do not just become less manipulable, you become more magnetic. Not because you control others, but because you are no longer controlled by fear. People feel it in you. The calm clarity, the unshakable presence, the energy that says, "I know who I am, and I do not need to convince you." That is what true power looks like. Not domination, not manipulation, but coherence. You walk into rooms without shrinking. You speak without apology. You love without losing yourself. You disagree without fearing exile, because you trust your truth more than anyone else's approval. And that changes everything. So if you are still in the thick of it, still untangling, still learning, still unsure, that's okay. Healing is not linear. Some days you will slip. Some days you will doubt yourself again. But even in those moments, remember this. Every time you pause to reflect instead of react, every time you choose discomfort over betrayal, every time you ask, "Does this serve my soul?" instead of "Will they still like me?" you are building something no manipulator can touch. You are building a self that is no longer for sale. You are building your freedom. To underestimate the cost of manipulation is to underestimate the silent erosion of the self. Because manipulation rarely arrives as an obvious wound. It does not always shout, hit, or demand. Often it whispers. It cloaks itself in charm, in empathy, in the language of love and protection. And this is what makes it so dangerous. Not just what it takes from us in the moment, but what it quietly steals over time. Clarity, confidence, inner coherence. Let us begin with the personal. When you are manipulated, especially over a long period, you start to lose trust in your own perception. The voice inside you, your intuition, your reason, your emotional compass, gets gradually overruled. You begin to second-guess what you feel. You ask others for permission to believe your own experiences. You apologize for things you did not do. This psychological fog is not just disorienting, it is identity fracturing. Imagine a child growing up with a parent who constantly rewrites reality. You are too sensitive. That did not happen. You always make me the bad guy. Over time, the child begins to distrust not the parent, but themselves. They internalize the idea that their feelings are flawed, their memories unreliable. They grow into adults who either suppress their voice or anxiously seek validation. This, too, is manipulation, not always born of malice but of unresolved wounds passed down like family heirlooms. In romantic relationships, the impact is even more intimate. A manipulative partner might isolate you from friends under the guise of exclusivity. They might use guilt as currency. "If you really loved me, you'd do this." Over time, your world shrinks. You begin to perform love rather than feel it. You confuse loyalty with silence, sacrifice with self-betrayal. What makes this dynamic so devastating is that manipulation mimics intimacy. It creates dependency, not connection. The manipulated person feels needed, seen, even special, until they are not. And when they try to reclaim their power, the manipulator may weaponize past affection. "After everything I did for you?" This is not just emotional strain. It is a slow death of authenticity. And in the workplace, manipulation wears a different mask. Professionalism. A manager who flatters you before overloading your tasks. A colleague who subtly takes credit while praising your team spirit. A system that measures your worth by output while preaching wellness and balance. These environments do not just stress us, they confuse us. They train us to tolerate contradiction, perform enthusiasm while feeling burned out, show compliance while seething inside. Over time, the dissonance becomes emotional exhaustion, and people begin to lose not just energy, but direction. Manipulation also shows up in how society shapes collective identity. Consider how media narratives can frame entire groups, telling people who they should fear, who they should admire, what success looks like, what failure means. These stories often go unquestioned, not because we agree, but because they are repeated so often they begin to feel like truth. The manipulated citizen may still vote, speak, and consume, but under the illusion of freedom. They do not realize that their desires have been curated, their outrage directed, their choices narrowed. This is not a conspiracy theory, it is a psychological phenomenon. As Noam Chomsky once noted, the smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow very lively debate within that spectrum. Even our self-help culture can subtly manipulate. It promises transformation, but often by feeding a deeper wound, that you are not enough as you are, that your pain is a problem to be fixed, not a story to be understood. Manipulation does not always degrade. Sometimes it idealizes. It places you on a pedestal not to honor you, but to own you. The emotional consequences of manipulation are profound. Anxiety, depression, low self-worth, they do not always come from within. Sometimes they are logical responses to environments where your boundaries have been consistently crossed and your reality consistently dismissed. Manipulation breeds fragmentation. You feel one thing, say another, do a third. You wear masks so well you forget what your own face looks like. And beneath the performance is often a quiet grief, the grief of not being seen, the grief of betraying yourself to stay safe, to be loved, to belong. Historically, we see this pattern again and again. In totalitarian regimes, manipulation was not just propaganda. It was public theater. Citizens were forced to cheer for leaders they feared. Loyalty was measured in applause, not belief. And even when people knew the system was corrupt, many complied, not out of agreement, but out of exhaustion. In the myth of Narcissus and Echo, Narcissus is the manipulator, offering glimpses of affection but never full presence. Echo, cursed to only repeat what others say, loses her voice and fades away. The tragedy is not just that Narcissus cannot love, but that Echo forgets how to speak her own truth. Even religious institutions at times have used manipulation cloaked in doctrine, promising salvation in exchange for obedience, demanding purity while exploiting guilt. It is not faith that manipulates. It is hierarchy without humility, power without accountability. But perhaps the deepest cost of manipulation is existential. When we are repeatedly manipulated, we begin to ask, who am I if I cannot trust what I feel? This is not just a philosophical question. It is a spiritual wound. To live without manipulation is not simply to be safe from others. It is to return to the integrity of the self, to reclaim the right to know, feel, and speak your truth, to no longer contort your soul to fit someone else's frame. And the consequences of not doing so extend into every area of life. In relationships, you settle. In work, you shrink. In purpose, you drift. You become skilled at reading the room, but forget how to read yourself. You mistake people-pleasing for kindness, silence for peace, compliance for wisdom. But here is the beautiful, uncomfortable truth. No one can manipulate you without your participation. That does not mean it is your fault. It means that healing begins not with blame, but with awareness. We cannot control whether people try to manipulate us, but we can learn to see it, name it, and choose differently. That is what the next section will explore, because if the impact of manipulation is fragmentation, then the solution is integration, a return to inner coherence. A way of living where what you feel, say, and do are finally in alignment. To protect yourself from manipulation is not simply to build walls, it is to cultivate clarity, to come home to yourself so fully that no one else's confusion can become your compass. The world will not stop trying to influence you. People will not suddenly become less persuasive, strategic, or self-interested. What can change, what must change, is your relationship with your own mind and heart. Because the true defense against manipulation is not suspicion. It is self-awareness. Let us begin with a practical but powerful practice. Emotional check-ins. This is a simple act of pausing regularly throughout your day to ask, what am I feeling? What triggered this? Does this emotion belong to me, or was it projected onto me? These small moments of reflection interrupt the automatic responses that manipulators rely on. When you can name your feeling, you can own it. And when you own your emotions, no one else can use them against you. From a psychological perspective, this is linked to emotional regulation, a cornerstone of mental health. It means being able to feel without being overwhelmed, to respond without being reactive. Practices like journaling, mindfulness, and even body scans can help you tune into your emotional state before it spirals or is hijacked. A second practice is learning to recognize manipulation tactics. Here are a few common ones. Love bombing, overwhelming you with affection, gifts, or praise early on to create dependency. Guilt tripping, making you feel selfish for having needs or setting boundaries. Gaslighting, denying your reality to make you doubt your perception. Triangulation, bringing a third party into a conflict to create jealousy, comparison, or confusion. Knowledge here is power. When you see the pattern, you can break the spell. You begin to ask, is this about connection or control? But noticing manipulation is not enough. We must also strengthen what manipulation targets: your boundaries. A boundary is not a wall to keep people out. It is a bridge that lets you relate without losing yourself. It is the space where your needs, values, and dignity are protected. Here is a simple framework. Your boundary is what you are responsible for: your thoughts, feelings, choices. What others are responsible for is not your burden: their reactions, projections, or stories. When someone crosses a boundary, your role is not to fix them, but to reinforce the line. You can say, I understand you're upset, but I won't continue this conversation if it gets disrespectful. That doesn't work for me. I hear you, and I still disagree. No justification, no apology for having limits. You are not rude for asserting a boundary. You are responsible. Boundaries are where your power lives. Machiavelli, though often framed as a strategist of cold power, had an interesting view here. In The Prince, he said that a wise ruler must not only defend against external enemies, but also maintain order within the state. Translate this to the psychological realm. You are the ruler of your own inner kingdom. If you do not create order inside, if you do not govern your thoughts, your values, your boundaries, then chaos enters. Not always as violence, sometimes as charm, but even with awareness and boundaries, many people struggle with one core issue: people-pleasing. Often rooted in childhood environments where love was conditional, people-pleasing becomes a survival strategy. You learn to scan for others' needs before your own. You equate harmony with safety. But harmony at the cost of self is not peace. It is performance. To break this pattern, you must reconnect with your authentic needs. Ask yourself, what do I need right now? Where do I feel resentment? Resentment often points to a boundary violation. What am I afraid will happen if I say no? Write your answers. Speak them aloud. Let your needs exist without judgment. Needs are not selfish. They are sacred. And when you honor them, you become harder to exploit. Here, ancient wisdom can help us. The Stoics practiced something called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. Each morning, they would imagine all that could go wrong: betrayal, loss, insult, not to become pessimistic, but to cultivate resilience, to say, even if this happens, I will not be broken. You can adapt this by mentally rehearsing situations where someone tries to manipulate you. Picture yourself staying calm, asserting your truth, walking away if needed. This is not paranoia. It is rehearsal. The nervous system, like the mind, learns through repetition. From the Sufi tradition comes another powerful practice, zikr, or remembrance. It is not about memory. It is about anchoring. In Sufi thought, the heart becomes lost in the noise of the world. Zikr brings it back to source, to stillness, to truth. Whether you practice zikr, prayer, breathwork, or quiet solitude, the principle is the same. Come back to yourself daily. Do not wait until you are manipulated to seek your center. Make presence a habit. Let silence be your mirror. Another modern tool worth mentioning is cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. CBT teaches us to identify and reframe distorted thinking. Thoughts like, I have to make everyone happy. If I upset them, they will leave. Maybe they're right. Maybe I am too sensitive. These beliefs are fertile ground for manipulation. CBT helps you challenge them and replace them with more balanced thoughts. I am not responsible for other people's emotions. My needs are valid. It's okay to disappoint others when I honor myself. Therapy, in general, is one of the most powerful paths to becoming manipulation resistant. Not because it makes you harder, but because it makes you clearer. It helps you see what stories you inherited, what patterns you repeat, and what freedom feels like in your nervous system. Finally, practice discernment over judgment. Judgment says, that person is bad. Discernment says, that behavior does not serve me. Judgment hardens the heart. Discernment sharpens the mind. Not everyone who tries to influence you is malicious. Sometimes they are unconscious. Sometimes they are hurting. But that does not mean you must stay. Learn to walk away without war, to leave without explanation, to trust your no as much as your yes. This is where true power lives, not in control, but in alignment. Because when you are clear within, no one can blur your vision. When you know your values, no one can sell you theirs. When you trust your voice, no one can silence it with praise or threat. This is not a one-time fix. It is a daily path. But with each step, you reclaim what manipulation seeks to steal: your attention, your energy, your sovereignty. And once you taste that sovereignty even briefly, you will never again trade it for belonging, affection, or peace. You will begin to live not as someone guarding against life, but as someone finally walking in your own truth. There is a moment, quiet, unmistakable, when you realize that your power was never truly lost. It was only borrowed, dispersed, negotiated away in subtle moments for comfort, belonging, or fear. But deep down, beneath every compromise, every silence you swallowed, it remained, the unshaken core of who you are. This journey, from being manipulated to becoming sovereign, is not just about defending yourself from others. It is about finally stopping the manipulation of yourself. Because long after the gaslighter leaves, long after the manipulative boss or parent or partner exits your life, the patterns they planted may linger. You start doubting your instincts. You anticipate reactions. You edit your truth before you even speak it. But that can change. To never be manipulated again does not mean you will never be targeted. It means you have become awake. Awake to your value. Awake to your boundaries. Awake to the patterns and stories that once kept you entangled. And from this wakefulness comes something even more powerful than resistance: discernment. We often think of manipulation as a war of minds, but really it is a disconnection of hearts. When you are cut off from your own emotional truth, you are more easily led by others' narratives. When you live in fear of disapproval, rejection, or loss, you are more likely to abandon yourself to keep the peace. This is where the historical and the psychological meet. Machiavelli understood that people could be ruled more effectively through illusion than force. And while he may have offered that advice to princes, today's manipulators apply it in far subtler ways, online, in relationships, in institutions. They curate impressions. They exploit emotional needs. They engineer consent, not through truth, but through repetition and charm. And yet, even Machiavelli warned of the cost. A prince who rules only by fear, he wrote, may stay in power, but he will never be loved. And what is a life of influence if it is hollow? What is a mind that gets its way if it loses its center? In a world obsessed with persuasion, authenticity becomes an act of quiet rebellion. To know your values and speak them clearly. To walk away from what insults your soul, even when it's wrapped in flattery. To stop negotiating your worth in rooms where your presence is already questioned. These are not just personal victories. They are cultural ones. Because the more people who refuse to be manipulated, the more a society shifts toward transparency, respect, and emotional maturity. But let's be honest, this path is not glamorous. It will cost you relationships that depended on your silence. It will force you to confront your own coping mechanisms, your own times of manipulation, whether conscious or subtle. It will stretch your capacity to stand alone in your truth before being celebrated for it. And still, it is worth it, because what you reclaim is not just safety. It is intimacy with yourself. It is the ability to trust your gut again, to hear your intuition not as a whisper, but as a voice of authority. To live with coherence, where your inner world is no longer at war with the roles you perform. The Stoics taught that we must control what is within our power and release what is not. The Sufis taught that what is real cannot be taken from you. And psychology teaches us that healing does not come from avoiding triggers, but from learning to respond to them with clarity and care. So, how do we live in a manipulative world without becoming cynical? By staying anchored, by practicing the radical discipline of checking in with ourselves, by refusing to rush decisions just because someone else is uncomfortable with our pause. This is not perfection. This is presence. And presence, when sustained, becomes wisdom. You do not have to live with a guarded heart. You do not need to suspect every smile, challenge every gesture, doubt every compliment. You only need to cultivate enough inner alignment that anything which asks you to betray yourself, however sweet it sounds, becomes obvious. Not everything that looks like love is love. Not everything that sounds like truth is truth. And not every request deserves your energy, your explanation, or your surrender. So here is the invitation. Return to yourself. Each morning, with breath. Each night, with reflection. Let self-awareness become your compass. Let boundaries become your shield. Let discernment become your quiet form of power. You are not here to be controlled. You are here to be conscious. And when you are truly, fully, consciously awake, manipulation has no place left to hide. If this exploration stirred something in you, some recognition, some remembering, then this space is for you. Because here, we are not chasing shortcuts to confidence or hacks for happiness. We are walking the deeper path, the one that leads through history, psychology, and soul. The path that asks you not just who you want to be, but what stories have shaped you, what wounds you've mistaken for personality, and what power still waits quietly within you. To never be manipulated again is not a destination. It is a commitment, a quiet, daily vow to come back to yourself, clearer, braver, and more grounded than yesterday. That is the work we do here, together. On this channel, we explore the places where ancient wisdom meets modern insight. We talk about power, not as domination, but as integrity, about leadership, not as control, but as self-mastery, about healing, not as fixing what is broken, but remembering what is true. So if you are drawn to that, if you feel the call to think deeper, feel more honestly and grow in ways that actually last, then I invite you to subscribe. Because this is not content for the distracted scroll. This is a space for reflection, for inner work, for asking the questions that matter, quietly, courageously, and with the kind of curiosity that leads to transformation. You and I, we are part of a long lineage. Philosophers, seekers, rebels, people who refuse to sleepwalk through life, people who chose clarity over comfort, truth over performance, vision over approval. That is who this space is for. So if you're ready to keep walking this path of depth, of freedom, of emotional intelligence, then come with us. There are more stories to tell, more tools to learn, more truths to remember. This journey is not easy, but it is yours, and you never have to walk it alone.